Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a video about what I'm calling some of the new kids on the block. And these are some individuals that I'm bringing into the conversation. Just looking at the list now, I should have probably mentioned Daniel Vervaeke because I've been watching more of his videos lately too. Andrew Root, Mark Sawyers, Stephen Smith, David Sloan Wilson. So just going to do some mentioning about some of these individuals and why I see them, they're important. Andrew Root. Andrew Root is a professor at a Lutheran seminary. He's sort of a moderate mainline figure. His wife is I don't know what denomination, maybe Lutheran clergy. If you read his books, he makes certain noises that basically are hinting at his preference for LGBT inclusion. He's got two of a trilogy of books coming out. The first book was, and all of these books have focused on Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age has become a pretty important book. You've heard me mention it for quite a while now. Good number of preachers across the spectrum refer to it to try to get a handle on secularization and what has been happening to the church in terms of deconstruction, in terms of demythologizing, in terms of disenchantment. All of these issues sort of run through Taylor, and in many ways Taylor has sort of become the go-to philosopher of this for a broad group of people. Now Root is interesting in that he's basically applying the disenchantment thesis to the church and to the clergy. Clergy and churches are in the grip of secularism and the loss of an enchanted place. There's captivity of the main line. He had a really good conversation with Paul Anleitner, and I'll put the link to that below, where I think Paul did an excellent job of sort of walking Andrew through the main points of his thesis and how this gets applied. It was very interesting, some of what he said about, he's very honest, and I really appreciate that about Andrew Root. He talked about the captivity of the main line to disenchantment, and how in many ways they're sort of just kind of lost out there. They don't have a mission. They don't quite know what to do. They're sort of parroting a lot of the justice stuff, but beyond that, they don't have a lot to offer. Evangelicals and fundamentalists and charismatics are continuing in many ways to push the enchantment idea, and as Andrew Root said, in some ways they get the supernova effect that Charles Taylor talks about. What happens is that, in a sense, God goes so far away, he becomes everywhere, and we sort of get a renewed God number one all over the place. Charismatics, of course, have been full-on resistors of disenchantment all the way through, and I think that's one of the better ways to understand the charismatic movement. While Andrew, I think, does an exceptional job applying Taylor and talking about the effects of what Taylor has mapped out, I don't really, including neo-sacramentalism, I don't think Andrew Root, at least in his first two books, really seemed to have an answer for any of this. Even in the subtitle to the book, Ministry to People Who No Longer Need a God. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is Christian ministry subsumed by the modern therapeutic movements, by doctors and therapists and motivational speakers? Have they kind of colonized the Christian space, and therefore pastors don't really have anything left to do? Well, in many ways, that's sort of the question that pastors are dealing with. A second person, Mark Sayers. I saw Mark's name, noticed it come up in an article in Mere Orthodoxy about individualism, and it was quite a good article, but it sort of led me down the link path to take a look at Mark Sayers and some of the things that he's been saying. He's been sort of deconstructing secularism and has a shorthand for it. He calls it the kingdom without a king. And he, in terms of Christian voices, and especially evangelical voices, has been one of the few that has noted what John Gray and Tom Holland have noted that in many ways, secular humanism is a continuity of Christianity, especially with respect to ethics. And so Mark Sawyers has been working on this. He's got actually quite a few books out, and I haven't read any of them. But he's been working on this for a while. Now Sawyers is a pastor of a church in Melbourne, Australia. It seems like more and more of my roads are passing through Melbourne. Sawyers continues to fully embrace God number 2, but is looking for a way out of the culture war polarities. And so he tag-teamed with a pastor of a church in Portland, and there's a little podcast with a number of episodes called This Cultural Moment, and I'll put the link to that down in the notes as well. Now, I don't think their analysis really goes anywhere deep enough into deconstructing secularism or secularization. They're aware of Charles Taylor. I think Mark's got some fresh ideas that he brings to the conversation, but I don't think their analysis goes deep enough. So I might actually pursue some of these individuals and see if perhaps they'll want to talk. They very well might. Their evangelical program sort of goes right to the edge of deconstruction in a way, but I think remains susceptible to it. They're going to have to fully face why God number 2 has been deconstructed in terms of the meaning crisis, the question of persons, and some of those kind of things. And God number 2 has been disenchanted away rather than just pursue an undeconstructed evangelical application. In other words, in listening to them, at least at this point, and maybe that's unfair because I haven't read his books, I don't know that their critique will necessarily go deep enough in terms of the ways that Christians and churches will have to address this, as John Vervaeke calls, the meaning crisis. A third individual is Steve Smith, and he's appeared in a number of my recent videos. His background is Mormon. He's a legal scholar, teaches in the San Diego School of Law. He's written this book, which I've mentioned a number of times, Pagans and Christians in the City. And he, too, is working on the definition of secular and reframing the disenchantment thesis completely. I think he has a much deeper appreciation for the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary, which is what's sort of been percolating up in my mind in order to try to think through these things. He's remapping the immanence transcendent polarity onto the historical pagan and Christian struggle. And whereas I think there are some issues with this thesis, I think it provides a fair amount of light. And some of the arguments he makes in the videos that are out there, I find rather compelling. That, in fact, a lot of the culture war stuff that we have going about symbols, this is pretty important stuff. And I think it's something we need to spend more time thinking about. So I hope to get into more of his videos as we go. As I said, I think his thesis has some shortcomings, but also some promise. This maps onto the Christian project of the reconciliation of heaven and earth. His immanence, transcendence, sort of maps onto my God number 1, God number 2. And so I think he's a helpful voice in this conversation. I think it nicely illuminates the attention needed to the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary, which is a very awkward way of trying to articulate what so many people are fighting over when it comes to religion and secularity, or the public symbols of what is sacred. And so Stephen Smith basically makes an argument that for the pagan world, sacredness was very imminent. For the Christian world, that which is sacred is very much in the heavenlies. Now, there's a lot of nuance that can be applied to that dichotomy, but as a rough dichotomy, as I said, I think it bears some fruit. Another individual who I've mentioned recently is David Sloan Wilson. And so he's, to my knowledge, a non-religious person. He made some favorable comments towards Buddhism in this conversation that he had with Jonathan Haidt that Adam had posted on one of Adam's sub-channels, Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson. And he also had a conversation with Gad Saad. if Jordan Peterson gets back in the game, David Sloan Wilson would be a very good conversation partner with Jordan Peterson. Because his father was a well-known writer, a playwright, and an author. And Wilson has some of those sensitivities, but he's also a scientist. And so I think actually he and Jordan Peterson could make a very interesting team. So his illumination of the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary, and I'm going to have to flesh that out as I keep going, probably not in this video, but videos to come, and the role that it plays in the development of humanity. I think this very much follows Brett Weinstein's 2 tracks. There's a culture track, and you simply cannot understand human beings in competition and cooperation without understanding the absolutely fundamental nature of this symbolic world. And I think this is part of the reason that Jonathan Pageau is so helpful right now, because Jonathan's instincts and ability to read symbolism, and I think the word symbolism falls a little short, because it's not just, when you think of symbolism, often we think of a static image, like that's a symbol. But it's not just a static image, it's these archetypes, and it's the dramas that we play in our life, and it's the liturgies that we embody. And this is happening not in the physical space, but it's happening, as Charles Taylor talks about, in the imaginary. This is in the imaginary space. And David Sloan Wilson is absolutely right that it's in these spaces that we're having our battles. It's the loss of Christianity and the church in this space, which makes, in the words of Andrew Root, clergy now unimportant, incidental, and really without a role to play in society. I think Mark Sawyers is getting at this, but hasn't quite gotten deep enough. But I think this, in terms of legal struggles, is exactly what Stephen Smith is dealing with. Now, David Sloan Wilson, for him, this is all a part of basically the triumph of evolution, and he uses evolution in the word evolution in a very religious manner, and that will be something to poke out a little bit and explore and ask, okay, well, if you sort of blow Darwin's idea of this all the way up, what does it look like? And in some ways, Peterson did similar with his Darwinian truth. But David Sloan Wilson seems like Jonathan Haidt to be a peacemaker. And so what he's really trying to do is help religious people and scientists understand each other better. And so he, in terms of the bone he throws to the scientist, is an unabashed Darwinian, and the bone he throws to the religious is the insistence that this symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary is absolutely essential in order to understand how human beings cooperate and compete. So, I've been impressed with a lot of what he's put forward. Not that I don't have my critiques, but I welcome what seems to be his project into this space. And his conversation with Gad Saad that I've mentioned in a variety of videos, I think is sort of essential watching, because the last from 49:26 to the end of the video, which is 1 hour and 9 minutes, they get into it deeply, and I think the positions between them couldn't be clear enough. And David Sloan Wilson tries to press in on Gad Saad about this, and I think Gad Saad simply doesn't see it. And it's some of this not seeing, which is what I think we saw in Jordan Peterson talking to Sam Harris. So evolution is taken up into a fully religious valence for David Sloan Wilson. I'm not sure the concept is up to the task, and it's given the authority of a god or a person, but the definition is blind in process. So in that sense, I don't know how much help it is to, in a sense, fully resolving the meaning crisis. But again, I really welcome his contribution into this space. Well, how do the new kids on the block match up with our current cast of players? Because we've been pursuing this journey already with, I think, an important group of really helpful thinkers and conversation partners. Now, this is a little hazardous here because I'm going to talk about these men who I consider my friends, and I think on their part they have affection towards me. And my conversations with them have been really helpful, although there are differences between us. Now, Jonathan Pageau and I count in terms of the Christian line. We're both on the side of, we're both on Team Christian together, but there are some distinctions between us. He's a convert to Orthodoxy and is an icon carver, fully embraces Christianity, God number one and God number two. In many ways, the new wave into Orthodoxy, I think, is a neo-trad wave. And just to borrow this terminology from some of what's going on within the Roman Catholic Church, I think American Orthodoxy is fully embracing this mantle, at least from what I can see about it, at least from the individuals that I see most often who are often converts from evangelicalism. And I don't think that is incidental. I think those who have gone to orthodoxy intentionally from evangelicalism or fundamentalism are, in a sense, feeling the movement in the imaginary and really reaching out for the neo-sacramental. And again, I've seen these movements happening in my own denomination, in evangelical churches. For many, the move into a more traditional Anglicanism is a part of that. This is a part of a much bigger movement, and in many ways, this is a move to address the meaning crisis, and this is a move to address secularity. So it's sort of a neo-bigo orthodoxy, and whereas I don't have any experience in this, it would be very interesting to chart the Orthodox immigrant experience versus the converts to orthodoxy experience. It's going to be a very interesting relationship to watch. They're very much addressing the symbolic and sacramental needs. I think, however, it's a bit naive as to whether you can simply go back. When Bilbo, to riff a little bit on the hero's journey, when Bilbo returns to the Shire, and when Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin return to the Shire, they are different from those who stayed in the Shire. And I think that will be a source of very interesting. That will be a very interesting development to watch as this wave takes on years. Because here's the thing: when you join a church movement, it's a new home. You don't just stay for 2 or 3 years. You intend to live in it for the rest of your life. And so I think individuals who are immigrating to the United States from places where the Orthodox Church has had long-standing traditions, and those who are coming into the Orthodox Church, those who have had their past in different American churches, it's going to be very interesting to see how these two, what comes of these two movements, how this goes. Now, from what I understand, with the emphasis on liturgy and the symbolism as it is, maybe there won't be much tension between the groups or needed conversation between the groups. But again, I'm interested to see how that goes long term. I think there's a denial about reconstruction. Because again, Bilbo comes back to the Shire changed. The Shire is never the same after Bilbo comes back and after Frodo comes back. Tolkien's pretty clear on that, and as I said, sometimes I see this even in the Christian Reformed Church. People who grew up in it are sometimes a little bit different from people who convert into it. It's not the same church for both parties, and so long term, it'll be interesting to watch how this plays out. John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist, post-Christian in many ways, non-theist, practitioner of meditation, Tai Chi, a variety of martial arts, but deeply conversant And I'm continually impressed with John by is how what a good conversation partner he is for someone exploring in this way. Deeply appreciate that from John. He's a physicalist, not a materialist, a physicalist, and of course, John's a very well-educated man who's been thinking about these things and living into them, not just thinking about them, but living into them for a very long time. And so his positions are highly articulated, nuanced, and complex. He's been deconstructing narrative and divine personhood. And so these are some of the areas of conversation. And as in my last conversation with John and Jonathan, I sort of see myself in some ways in between, wanting to facilitate some dialogos between them. His perspective is non-teleological, and so again, in this sense, Jonathan Pageau and I are very much on the same page. We sort of a full embracing of teleology, a full embracing of narrative, a full embracing of divine personhood. But John can easily hold his own. And so, at least for me, the conversations have been productive and enlightening. And I very much appreciate John, giving us his time and attention, as he always thanks his audience for at the end of his awakening from the meaning crisis. But he's pursuing a religion that isn't a religion. And of course, for Jonathan Pageau and I, we continue to believe that Christianity remains a very living, remains the way, the truth, and the life. We see no need of another path. And John is working hard to establish communities and an ecology of practices and all of this. So, continued member of the old kids on the block. And of course, in some ways, the big daddy who got us all going, the unauthorized exorcist, Jordan B. Peterson, and the moment that he stepped onto the political, cultural stage and sort of ripped a hole in it, and we've all sort of been following through. He broke the celebrity atheist spell, I think, for a generation of younger people. I think in many ways he was the tip of the spear, and he blazed a new trail. Even though, of course, myself, Jonathan Pageau, and John Vervaeke all have differences with Jordan on a variety of things. I don't think anybody has played a role in this process like Jordan Peterson did. And maybe we'll do again. We'll have to see. And part of the reason for that is Jordan Peterson is so thoroughly multilingual, while still being himself. His ideas of Darwinian truth and pragmatism, classical liberal modernist, yet sufficiently postmodern to be able to engage in those conversations. And unlike many in this space, not allergic to religion, unlike a lot of the celebrity atheists that sort of followed in his wake in terms of the classical liberal activist mode. But I don't think really can hold a candle to him in terms of what he was able to do and what has annoyed the celebrity atheist community. The Uber Boyos just Stefan put out a video, "Is the Movement Over?" And just classic Uber Boyo video. And the title in YouTube, "Betrayed by the West He Tried to Save." Jordan Peterson, in that sense, was taken by the kingdom of pharma. Will there be a second coming of Jordan Peterson? Will there be a second wave? Will his if he's able to come back, even with only partial strength, will it be decadent in that he just repeats all the same lines and doesn't bring anything new to the conversation? I don't know. Was he captured by the culture war that sort of launched him to power, but I think in some ways towards the end sort of became less fresh in terms of addressing some of the items. I don't know. He remains one of the most intriguing characters in this story, and I certainly pray for his full recovery, because I think what he brings to the table is unique, and I very much miss the old Jordan from the classroom lectures and from the biblical series, and a lot of the fresh things that I think he was able to bring, and I think the integrity and power with which he brought it. So very much want to see Jordan back in the game. There's a bunch of other role players to watch. Jonathan Haidt, in some ways, I found him before I found Jordan Peterson, and a number of you out there are the same way. He's a peacemaker, and he's also very multilingual. He can speak. He's not really a culture war. He's not really a culture warrior for either side. He's sort of a peacemaker. He wants people to understand each other. He's a careful academic, and really, in many ways, has got a lot of this started. The Weinstein brothers. I just listened to a Brett video today, and again, I continue to listen to him with appreciation, but I worry about political audience culture war capture for Brett. He's with his little daily podcasts, a lot of repetition about the same old thing, and getting captured by an audience is a very big danger, especially if you're following the YouTube metrics, because you do a little something and your rating goes up. You say, oh, I'll do that again, and your rating goes up. And so you go up and up and up and up, and it looks like you're getting more and more important, but are you basically just building a silo, or are you able to actually broaden your reach and extend? Again, it's sort of the challenge that Donald Trump has in this election. He's trying to motivate his base, but he's alienated so much beyond his base. And so I think the challenge for Brett is to continue to expand his base, not simply to keep staying within this little narrow focus. Eric also, ADHD, brilliant, but sometimes a little untethered, erratic. Again, I really like both these guys. We'll see what they're able to do longer term. Rebel Wisdom continues to make really solid contributions. I don't think they've quite figured out what to do with the church. And, they've spoken with me. They've spoken with Jamie Smith. I just think they don't quite know what to do with the church. And that's not uncommon in their space. Jamie Smith, and he comes up every now and then, professor of philosophy at Calvin College. A lot of the work he does is very much connected with Charles Taylor and should be all over this space. But is he sort of in captivity to the evangelical Christian college intelligentsia? Jordan Peterson was able to sort of explode and expand his reach, and others have sort of followed in that wake. I don't see Jamie Smith really wanting to do any of that. Well, he's an academic, and academics are academics. But will he join the conversation? I'd like to see it, but I don't know. And there's a whole bunch of smaller channels that are really worth watching, channels that I deeply appreciate, and little sub-communities of our community. Again, Paul and Leitner just recently did a conversation with Andrew Root, which I think is important. Paul's been doing terrific work in his podcast. He doesn't post a lot on YouTube. Most of his audience is in his podcast. So if you haven't subscribed to his podcast, I really recommend it. Karen in the Meaning Code, again, continuing to have really quality conversations with thoughtful people. Karen's a committed conservative evangelical and also an artist. And, deeply appreciate her work. Mary Cohen, of course. Love Mary. Mary just every time I talk to Mary, she just opens my eyes and teaches me all kinds of new things. As Julian noted early on in the history of my channel, oh, she's the smart lady from the comment section. Yes, she is. A lot of wisdom, a lot of life experience, always fresh and surprising and jarring. Take no prisoners, Mary Cohen. Love Mary. J.P. Marceau, kind of got acquainted with him much more in the Jonathan Pageau community. A Roman Catholic panpsychist who's got an advanced degree in philosophy and is living in France. J.P., very much worth listening to and finding. Burn Power, the man out in Tbilisi, Georgia, who makes very long videos about culture. Been on my channel a number of times. Always enjoy Burn's enormous catalog of cultural information built into a man with with a life long lived in Christian thought. So Burn's channel is worth checking out, especially if you're really looking to have some long form videos. If you think I put out long videos, nothing like Burn. The Uberboyos, these Jungians from across the ocean, always fresh, creative, dramatic, irreverent. I always find them fun to listen to, and I often come away with fresh insights and fresh ideas. The Randos, Job and Jeff and Luke, and a whole bunch of the folks in the Sam, a whole bunch of the folks in the Bridges of Meaning Discord who continue to put out stuff on YouTube, but the conversations and the communities at the Bridges of Meaning Discord I deeply appreciate. And the up-and-coming Vervaekians, of course, my friend Sloan, who was the one who pointed me to John Vervaeke, and a whole nother Discord server around Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, very regularly doing question and answer sessions with John Vervaeke, bringing in other guests, sort of a parallel to the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, but very much working in this space, much more philosophical and theoretical and esoteric than necessarily Bridges of Meaning. Bridges of Meaning tends to be a little bit more applicable and practical, and if they don't get too lost in theological disputing, I think a little bit more down to earth. To-do lists for me. The church needs to keep thinking and experimenting, and this is, in a sense, where I differentiate from the neo-trads. I really count the neo-trads as experimenters of a sort. Orthodoxy might not be new, which is exactly why they're attracted to it, but it's new to them. And so I have absolutely no critique or word to say against anyone who decides that their experimentation is best served in pursuing the tremendously traditional. I think it's a very savvy way to try to go into the future by going into the past. That being said, they're in many ways, I think they're parallel to unreconstructed charismatics who basically address the meaning crisis with full-blown denial of disenchantment. But I think in both cases, these are reconstructions. I don't see how they couldn't be. Those who are going over into traditionalisms, it's very different from having come through traditionalisms. And in many ways, I see that as the difference between someone in my shoes who, for 3 generations, 3.5 maybe, has been part of this Dutch Reformed tradition. Those who come to Calvinism through kind of the new restless and reformed movement, I think they see things differently, and I think that's just the way these things go. And so charismatics today are not like charismatics in the first century. They're not like Africans and Haitians who, in that way, haven't really passed through modernity or disenchantment. I think, and also going to have to think fresh and hard and experiment with practice. And I'm not much of a practical experimenter. I'm much more of a theoretical experimenter, because most of what we do here at Living Stones is basically a reflection of the culture and what we're trying to do. At the same time, prosecute the culture war with lots of cheek turning. What do I mean by that? I do think Christians have to be engaged in the culture war, and I think they have to do so vigorously, but I think they do so with the weapons of Jesus. Those are very costly weapons, especially for those who employ them. The chief weapon is love. And so I think the church and Christians must prosecute the culture war, but do so as Jesus did. In the question and answers today, I talked about that quite a bit. And it's also key to not getting captured by it or by war culture. So that's what I mean by prosecuting the culture war in the way that Jesus did. And also keep estuarying. What do I mean by that? This is caught and not taught. There's a lot of trial and error, figuring out structures and institutions as we go, developing personal relationships and relational networks that cut across some of our traditional tribal lines, and in that way find spaces of dialogos where we can talk, where we can grow, where we can learn, where we can appreciate. And so as we take a look at these new kids on the block, we'll see ways that we can bring them into the conversation and learn from them, maybe lure them into the estuary, and see what kinds of things we can learn. Thank you for your time and attention.